The court wasn't just full, it was electrified. Reporters lined the walls like statues holding pens instead of spears. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but every journalist knew their job wasn't just to report. It was to capture something unforgettable. This wasn't a trial. It was a performance, a message, a warning. At the center of it all was Karoline Leavitt, former White House aide, current congressional firebrand, and one of the youngest conservative leaders to ever square off with federal authority on live record. The charge? Contempt of Congress, subpoena defiance, alleged misuse of official communications. But everyone knew those were technicalities, excuses. What they really wanted was to silence her, to bury a voice that had gotten too loud, too fast, and had rattled the right cages. When Karoline entered the room, it was like someone had opened a window in a stuffy building. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. Her navy blue suit was clean, sharp, businesslike, but unbothered. She walked past the prosecutors with a kind of confidence that doesn't come from arrogance but from purpose. At the judge's bench sat Justice Harlan Brewster, a relic of the old political class. 68 years old, appointed during a more civil time in American politics, one where decorum was code for silence and order was enforced with a gavel and a sneer. He adjusted his robe and glanced down at Karoline like a principal addressing a troublemaker who'd stirred up the school board. "Miss Leavitt," he said, drawing out the miss with just enough patronization to be heard from the back row, "we ask that your statements today be brief, respectful, and, most importantly, confined to the facts as requested." She was still walking to her seat, not yet at the mic. But that's when it happened. She paused, turned, and dropped the sentence that would shatter the day, dominate the headlines, and echo from classrooms to congressional hearings for weeks. "If this court feared truth as much as it fears my voice, we'd have justice by now." The room froze. Reporters gasped. A few dropped their pens. The stenographer hesitated mid-keystroke. Judge Brewster blinked, unsure for just a breath if he'd heard her correctly. Karoline stepped behind the mic, calm, poised. And what she said next would be the opening salvo in a war that wasn't about legality. It was about narrative, about identity, about who gets to speak in modern America. Judge Brewster adjusted his glasses, trying to mask the ripple of discomfort across his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone half his age and with twice the public support. The court stenographer was already behind. Her fingers couldn't keep up with the speed at which the moment had shifted. Karoline stood behind the microphone now, her hands resting lightly on the wooden table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was a power in her stillness that forced the courtroom to lean in. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Leavitt, you will contain yourself to relevant testimony. This is not a campaign rally." She blinked once, slowly, then leaned just slightly into the mic. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't need a rally. I brought the truth." The air thickened. Her voice was calm but carried like a song sung in a canyon, clear, deep, unforgettable. "I was brought here under threat of contempt," she continued, "for refusing to comply with a subpoena demanding I reveal internal communications between myself and American citizens. Not foreign powers, not dark money, just people, concerned, involved, awake people." The prosecution shuffled papers, clearly hoping for a moment to object. They didn't get one. "I was told those emails posed a threat to national cohesion." "You know what else poses a threat to national cohesion?" she asked. "Fear. Fear that if you speak too loudly, too clearly, too honestly, you'll be dragged in front of a judge and told to sit down." The gallery was dead silent. "Let me be very clear," she said. "I didn't ignore the subpoena because I'm hiding something. I defied it because I'm protecting something." Her eyes locked with the judge's. "Speech, dissent, and the right to question a government that's forgotten who it works for." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. The prosecution rose. "Your Honor, we request that the witness be instructed to refrain from politicizing this hearing." Karoline cut in. "I'm not politicizing anything. I'm testifying to what they are too afraid to say in public, that the biggest threat to this institution isn't me, it's its own silence." The judge's gavel slammed once. "Miss Leavitt, I remind you this is a court of law." "And I remind you," she replied, "that the Constitution still applies in this courtroom, or has that become inadmissible too?" someone gasped. A camera flash popped outside the closed doors. Reporters were already live tweeting. Leavitt, if the Constitution's not welcome here, then neither is the Republic. Court tries to shush Karoline Leavitt. She just called them out to their faces. Judge Brewster sat back, unsure of his next move. Because for the first time in a long while, the courtroom didn't belong to the court. It belonged to her. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder, but it didn't shake the room. Not this time. It rang hollow, an old-world sound trying to regain control in a room that had already shifted allegiance. Miss Leavitt, Judge Brewster said, voice sharp, measured, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court. Karoline didn't blink. With respect, Your Honor, if truth is now considered contempt, then maybe you're in the wrong courtroom. A few jaws dropped. Someone near the back actually whispered, she just said that. The prosecution jumped in again, visibly flustered. We request immediate limitations on the scope of the witnesses' statements. This hearing is not the place for political philosophy. Karoline didn't miss a beat. That's rich, coming from the same people who greenlit a surveillance memo labeling school board parents as threats. You remember that, right? She paused. We're not in the age of policy anymore. We're in the age of narrative, and the story you want told today is that I'm reckless, that I'm dangerous, but all I've done is refuse to name private citizens who sent me emails expressing concern about government overreach. Judge Brewster narrowed his eyes. You were subpoenaed to cooperate in an investigation regarding the coordination of political messaging with external organizations. And I refused, Karoline interrupted, because those organizations are made up of citizens, not foreign agents. Not tech lobbyists, not corporate giants, mothers, teachers, veterans. You want me to feed them into your PR shredder so your inboxes stay clean? No, I won't do it. The judge sat back, his jaw tightened. You don't dictate this courtroom. Karoline leaned into the mic. Then maybe someone should. Because if the courts are no longer for the people, then what are they? PR machines, political stage plays, or just velvet-trimmed cages? Another murmur rolled through the room. This wasn't defiance for the sake of show. It was surgical, measured, unapologetic. Online, live streams were already dissecting every word. Clips of her face, controlled but fierce, were going viral on X, TikTok, YouTube. She's not just testifying, she's exposing the whole game. Leavitt just dragged the courtroom into the 21st century. Judge Brewster exhaled a long, slow breath like a kettle fighting not to boil. This court will recess for 10 minutes, he announced, slamming the gavel again. But this time it wasn't an assertion of power. It was a retreat. As he stood and vanished into the chambers behind the bench, Karoline stepped back from the mic and turned. Not to the press, to the people. Because she knew. This moment wasn't about legality. It was about legitimacy. The moment the judge disappeared behind chamber doors, the courtroom buzzed, not loudly, but electrically, like static before a lightning strike. Karoline Leavitt sat back, composed, her hands folded gently on the table in front of her. But her eyes, they were locked in, scanning the room, reading every reaction, memorizing every face that had tried to look away when she dropped truth like a brick through glass. Across the gallery, aides whispered into cell phones. One DOJ official was furiously typing, sending an urgent message, no doubt. On the third bench from the back, a staffer leaned toward a man in a grey suit and murmured, "She just nuked the narrative." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had started to gather. It started with reporters, but now civilians were joining in. Bystanders, activists, truck drivers and school teachers. Flags waved, homemade signs rose. Let Karoline speak. My voice sounds like hers. We the people, not we the protected. Inside, a young congressional aide walked over and quietly handed Karoline a phone with a live feed. "You're trending," she whispered. Karoline glanced at the screen. Let her speak, Karoline unfiltered, contempt of truth. And then just rising, Leavitt effect. But it wasn't about ego for her. It never had been. She handed the phone back and said softly, "They're not listening to me. They're listening to themselves, finally." Meanwhile, behind the bench, Judge Brewster was pacing. 3 senior officials stood around him. "We need to regain control of the optics," one whispered. "She flipped the entire frame," said another. "She's not the defiant defendant anymore. She's the whistleblower." "She made you the story, Harlan," said the third. and the public loves a David with a sharp tongue. The judge adjusted his robe again, staring down at a file labelled KL, Authorised Talking Points. He pushed it aside. That script had just died a quiet death. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution huddled around a laptop. "She's got people outside now," one muttered. "If this doesn't end soon, it's going to explode." "Too late," another said. "It already has." Karoline turned to her aide. "They'll come back in hot. Try to corner me with procedure, legalese. They'll hope I trip on their script." The aide looked nervous. "What if they don't let you speak again?" Karoline smiled, calm and cutting. "Then they've already lost." Because she knew now, the court didn't own this story anymore. America did. And silence wasn't an option. When the judge returned, he looked different. Still cloaked in the black robe of authority, still sitting above the room, but something about his posture had changed. Tighter, defensive, as if he realized the courtroom was no longer a place of control, but a battlefield where he was now exposed. "Court will resume," Judge Brewster announced. His voice was steady, but stripped of its earlier superiority. He cleared his throat, scanned the room, and this time didn't meet Karoline's eyes. "Miss Leavitt," he began, "you've made several statements outside the procedural boundaries of this hearing. We will now direct our attention strictly to the content of your refusal to comply with the subpoena." Karoline stood, slowly. But instead of walking back to the mic, she placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of her. "This," she said, "is a list of every person who reached out to me about overreach, censorship, and untraceable digital surveillance tied to federal programs. Some were teachers, some were veterans, a few were kids fresh out of college. None of them wanted fame, just answers." She looked up, dead calm. "I will not read their names." The prosecution nearly leapt from their chairs. "Your Honour, this is open defiance." But Karoline raised a hand, and the gallery went still again. "I will not read their names," she repeated. "Because I believe what many in this room have forgotten, that public service is not public submission. That a citizen's voice doesn't become government property the moment it dares to question government power." Then she stepped forward, back to the mic. "I was dragged into this room so you could make me a cautionary tale. A message. But here's the truth. I'm not the story. They are. The whistleblowers, the families who emailed me because they were too afraid to speak in public. The mother whose child's school banned her from PTA meetings after she shared CDC data. The veteran who discovered his phone was flagged after he Googled the words political bias." She paused, scanning the gallery. "They were silenced, and now you're trying to silence the one person who answered them." Her voice grew stronger now, less personal, more collective. "You can call it contempt, you can call it non-compliance, but I call it duty, because when the institutions built to protect liberty become obsessed with preserving their power, then the people who resist them aren't criminals, they're Americans." The judge shifted, lips pursed. Karoline continued, "If this court thinks silence equals submission, they're mistaken. Silence equals strategy, and mine ends right now." She reached into a folder and held up a document. Affidavits. 10 of them, all from federal employees, mid-level, off the record, who confirm the existence of private communication blacklists, algorithms used by contracted firms to flag certain political phrases for visibility reduction. The room gasped. A few people in the press pool stood instinctively. The prosecution scrambled. "This is not part of the evidence log." "Of course not," Karoline said, coolly, "because none of you asked the right questions." And then she hit them with the line that would ignite the fire even further. "You came here to prosecute a voice, but now you're sitting in a trial of your own legitimacy." It echoed. Online, the phrase became a thunderclap. Trial of legitimacy started trending within minutes. The judge raised his gavel, but didn't strike it. Because how do you silence someone when the nation has already started listening? For a long moment, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was something else, something electric. Everyone present, from seasoned journalists to security guards, felt it. They weren't witnessing a trial. They were witnessing history. Karoline Leavitt held the stack of affidavits like a torch. "These," she said clearly, "are signed under penalty of perjury. These aren't rumors. These are facts. Whistleblowers, some of them still employed by the very agencies that tried to subpoena me, testifying that speech is being filtered, throttled, buried. She set them down on the table, loud enough that the sound carried. They were never meant to see daylight, but I'm done playing by the rules of people who rewrite them to suit their silence. Judge Brewster finally spoke. His tone was tight, nervous. Miss Leavitt, the introduction of unsanctioned materials into this hearing is grounds for formal sanction. Karoline cut in, voice sharp but unshaken. Unsanctioned by whom? The people who tried to silence them in the first place? Who redacted every truth until it bled dry? The prosecution stood, rattled. Your Honour, we request an immediate suspension of this hearing until these claims can be validated by proper federal oversight. Karoline turned, pointing directly at them. You had that chance. You had months to ask the right questions. You didn't. You subpoenaed me instead. Not the contractors, not the agencies. Me. She stepped closer to the centre of the room. It was no longer about playing defence. You tried to make this hearing about my defiance, but what you didn't expect was documentation. And you sure didn't expect me to bring it here. The judge tapped his gavel once, not a bang, just a signal of desperation. Order. But Karoline raised her voice, not yelling, just resonant enough to rise above him. I've sat through enough of these where the only voices that mattered wore robes and lapel pins, where truth was delayed until it expired in committee, but not today. She picked up one of the affidavits and read aloud. I was instructed not to flag posts from foreign operatives, but to deprioritize U.S. accounts using the phrases election fraud, vaccine injury, or unconstitutional. I raised objections and was told, quote, this comes from the top. The courtroom gasped. That line hit social media like a shockwave. This comes from the top. In minutes, screenshots of the affidavit spread. People were demanding full release. Congressmen were calling emergency meetings. A senator from Texas tweeted, if Karoline Leavitt's documents are real, this isn't a hearing. It's a turning point. The judge's voice faltered now. Miss Leavitt, I strongly advise you to cease reading from those materials. They may compromise national security. She stared straight at him. No, Your Honour. What compromises national security is a government that hides behind red tape while citizens are digitally erased for thinking differently. The room froze. Because whether people agreed with her or not, one truth had become undeniable. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just speaking. She was unveiling. It didn't take long. By the time Karoline left the courtroom that evening, the counterattack had already begun. The headlines dropped first, manufactured, coordinated, and suspiciously timed. Leavitt linked to far-right digital activists, says former cybersecurity official. Experts question authenticity of Leavitt's whistleblower documents. Ethics watchdog opens review of Karoline Leavitt's public disclosures. Within hours, talking heads on every network were reciting the same phrases. She's weaponizing paranoia. She's not under attack, she's performing. An orchestrated martyr moment. The message was clear. Discredit her before her documents go mainstream. But Karoline had expected this, and she was ready. The morning after the hearing, she walked straight onto the set of a small but rising independent media outlet, live, unfiltered, with a USB drive in hand. The host barely got through introductions before Karoline leaned in and said, I know what they're trying to do. They're counting on people being too distracted, too numb, too exhausted to care about the details. So let's make it simple. She held up the drive. This contains full, anonymized versions of all 10 affidavits. Scrubbed, secured, time-stamped. We're making them public today. In full. The host's jaw dropped. You're releasing them yourself? Karoline smiled. No gatekeepers this time. An hour later, the documents went live on 3 mirrored sites and a decentralized peer-to-peer network. It spread like wildfire. Data analysts confirmed the metadata was intact. Cybersecurity pros validated the logs. 2 whistleblowers released voice messages confirming they'd given the testimonies willingly. Online, the narrative shifted again. People who had doubted her were now reading line-by-line accounts of government contractors throttling domestic speech. Internal Slack messages referencing politically dangerous sentiment pools. Email threads outlining invisible guardrails for controlling visibility without deletion. And then, the bombshell, an unredacted timestamp showing direct policy coordination with a known tech platform just 2 days before a series of flagged keyword bans. It was no longer a theory, it was policy. Back in DC, damage control reached full throttle. The Department of Homeland Security released a bland statement about misinterpretations of technical safety procedures. The DOJ issued a short denial, but the public, they'd already chosen their court. And it wasn't in a marble building, it was in the open. Karoline posted a simple statement to X. They thought this was about me. It never was. This was always about you. By nightfall, protesters had gathered outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "You tried to silence her. Now you hear all of us." Inside the system, panic quietly turned to fear, because the people who used to control the conversation no longer owned it. And Karoline Leavitt, she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The following Monday, the courtroom reopened. Officially, it was supposed to be a procedural continuation, a quiet day to review the submitted documents, per Judge Brewster's phrasing. But nothing about that day would be quiet, because Karoline Leavitt didn't show up alone. She walked in flanked by someone no one expected, Congressman Eli Varga, a center-left Democrat from Illinois, a former tech executive turned anti-censorship crusader, a man respected on both sides of the aisle for calling out big tech collusion before it was politically fashionable. Gasps rippled through the press as they walked down the aisle together. "What's he doing here?" whispered a court clerk. "Is he testifying?" asked a reporter from the back. Karoline took her seat. Eli Varga sat right behind her, not silent, not hidden. Deliberate. The message was clear. This is no longer a partisan story. This is American. Judge Brewster took his seat, looking even older than before. Greyer. Smaller. He glanced at the gallery, clearly rattled by Varga's presence. "The court will proceed," he muttered. Karoline stood once again, but this time her tone shifted. She wasn't just defending anymore, she was building something. "There are those who will try to paint this moment as chaos," she began, "as disruption. But disruption is only terrifying to those who've grown comfortable inside the silence." She motioned to the printed affidavits now stacked neatly on the table. What we exposed wasn't accidental. It was coordinated, funded, authorized, and it affected Americans of every political background. And then, the moment no one expected, she stepped aside. And Eli Varga stood up. He walked to the mic like a man arriving not to fight Karoline's battle, but to claim his own. "I may not agree with Miss Leavitt on everything," he said, "but this, the suppression of legal speech, the algorithmic blacklisting, the partnerships between unelected agencies and private platforms, that's not conservative or liberal. That's tyranny in code." The courtroom fell utterly silent. He continued, voice rising, "I've seen the internal Slack channels. I've seen the push notifications denied by legal. I've seen speech throttled, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient." He turned to Judge Brewster. "And I'm here today, Your Honor, to submit additional documentation, emails, back-end logs, metadata packets from inside 2 platforms currently under congressional review." He dropped a thick manila folder on the table. Judge Brewster tried to speak. Failed. Karoline stepped forward again. "They said I was dangerous, said I was theatrical. But what I did was simply refuse to betray the American people for convenience. And now even those you thought would never join me are here." Outside, a crowd had formed again. Bigger this time. Signs from both left and right. Union jackets beside Gadsden flags. Inside, for the first time since this hearing began, Judge Brewster looked unsure. Karoline looked around the room, then leaned forward and said the line that would define the next news cycle. "You called it a hearing. We turned it into a reckoning." Judge Brewster had lost the room. Not just physically, but symbolically. The chamber, once ruled by a gavel and guarded tradition, had become a glass house. And Karoline Leavitt, she'd thrown the first stone, and then handed stones to everyone else watching. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled. What began as a few dozen supporters had now turned into thousands, people who'd taken time off work, who'd driven hours, who didn't agree on everything. But agreed on this. They were done being muted. Inside, the judge shuffled through the folder Congressman Varga had just submitted. His hands trembled slightly, not because of guilt, because of exposure. The documents were real. Metadata logs, back-end suppression codes. Slack messages casually discussing how to pre-flag speech based on user location and voting district. Emails from federal agencies recommending silent adjustments to political commentary feeds ahead of elections. This wasn't hearsay anymore. It was infrastructure. Karoline stepped forward again. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply said, "You wanted to make an example out of me. You did, just not the one you intended." She turned to the gallery, now brimming with journalists, citizen reporters, and people live-streaming on their phones. Millions of Americans now know what happens behind closed servers and sealed rooms. They know now that silence isn't peace, it's programming. A federal official in the back stood up suddenly, trying to object. This is outside jurisdiction. But he was drowned out by the judge. Enough. Brewster's voice cracked like dry wood. This court will take a recess until... "No," Karoline said, stepping forward. "You can take a recess. The country won't." And in that moment, the back doors burst open, not with security, not with confrontation, but with a procession. Veterans, nurses, students, factory workers, a minister, a tech whistleblower, a local school board member suspended for questioning curriculum guidelines, all carrying written statements. The judge's eyes widened. "What is the meaning of?" Varga stepped forward. "They're here to testify, on the record, not as politicians, as Americans." "But this hearing isn't structured for that." "It wasn't structured for any of this," Karoline said. "You tried to script a conviction, but we wrote a confession, yours." And then came the final quote that made front pages the next morning in 42 states. "You silenced individuals. We responded with a choir. Try muting us all." Inside the courtroom, the tension snapped. Dozens in the gallery stood. Some began reciting excerpts from the Constitution. Others read from Karoline's documents. One teacher held up a sign that read, "This court's gavel doesn't work on the truth." Judge Brewster stood, then sat, and for the first time in his career he had nothing to say, because the story had left the courtroom and entered history. It took less than 24 hours for the aftershocks to ripple through the country. By sunrise, Karoline Leavitt's mic drop moment. "You silenced individuals. We responded with a choir," was on every front page. It was stitched into TikToks, blasted through podcasts, quoted by students in civics class and factory workers at shift change. This wasn't political anymore. It was cultural, a statement of reclamation. America had remembered its voice. By midweek, the court was in full retreat. Judge Brewster quietly filed for medical leave. The hearing was suspended pending federal review, which everyone understood was code for "we lost the script and now we're hiding under the table." Meanwhile, Karoline did not retreat. She didn't bask in attention. She didn't book a flashy talk show tour. Instead, she held a town square livestream, not from D.C., not from a studio, but from a small brick community center in New Hampshire, surrounded by people who looked like the ones in her affidavits. Farmers, firefighters, single moms, teachers who'd lost tenure, veterans in ball caps, a kid holding a homemade sign that read, "She talked, now we all do." Karoline stood at a simple mic, no teleprompter, no designer suit, just a hoodie with the First Amendment printed across the chest. This movement, she said, was never about a courtroom. It was never about one judge or one rogue agency. It's about you. You are no longer voiceless. You are no longer alone. And you are not required to sound perfect in order to speak truth. She lifted the stack of affidavits. These weren't just documents. They were confessions from a system too arrogant to imagine someone like me would walk in and refuse to kneel. She looked into the live stream camera where nearly 3 million people were watching live. I stood my ground in a courtroom built to crush dissent, and I didn't do it to be famous. I did it to break the silence. So if you're still wondering what's next, it's simple. She smiled. Calm. Fierce. It's your turn to speak. And just like that, she stepped back from the mic and handed it to a local nurse, then a school janitor, then a rancher. One by one, they spoke. Not in political jargon, not in rehearsed speeches. Just truth. And truth, once free, doesn't go back into the cage. In the weeks that followed, multiple agencies came under federal review. Legislation was proposed. Tech companies began issuing preemptive statements. And Karoline Leavitt? She wasn't in court anymore. She was on stages, in town halls, in high school gymnasiums and county fairs. The media tried to call it a political campaign, but she corrected them. This isn't a campaign. It's a microphone, and I'm just the first to pass it around.